They say every man is one decision away from a different life. For Dan, that choice came one late afternoon when he found himself face to face with Ramal, an old friend who had become a billionaire in the years since they'd last met. But to understand how he got there, we must go back to the day Dan met Rosa. Hello, family. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to send some love and gratitude to our amazing listeners from different countries. Your support means the world to us. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more intriguing tales. Let's continue. Dan was an ordinary young man, tall and charming, with an easy smile that hid a constant undercurrent of worry. Life in Aruka City had never been easy. Coming from a modest family, Dan knew struggle, and he dreamed of one day leaving behind the crowded streets he'd grown up in. He wanted more from life, though he often felt held back by circumstances beyond his control. Then he met Rosa. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever encountered. Reserved, yet warm, beautiful, yet simple. Unlike most women from wealthy families, she blended seamlessly with the bustling crowd, wearing nothing extravagant, just jeans and a plain blouse. Dan had no idea of her wealth, and she preferred it that way. To Rosa, money was nothing if people couldn't see beyond it. Their meeting was purely by chance. Rosa had just left her friend's house near the market when two men cornered her, blocking her path. "Hey, pretty girl, where do you think you're going?" one sneered, his voice taunting and dangerous. Fear struck her, but she maintained a calm exterior, scanning for an escape. Her heart pounded as she realized there was no way out. Then, suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. "Leave her alone!" Dan's voice was steady, laced with authority. He stepped in front of her, shielding her with his own body. One of the men laughed, sizing him up. "Who's this, your boyfriend?" he mocked. But Dan didn't flinch. The other man lunged forward, and in a moment of courage, Dan fought back, grappling with them while Rosa watched in horror. "Run!" he shouted at her, and she did, sprinting away. Only once did she look back, her heart sinking as she saw Dan struggling against their attackers. The men left him bruised and beaten, muttering angrily about how he'd cost them an easy prize. Finding nothing on him to steal, they spat at him in disgust before walking away, leaving Dan lying on the ground. Life moved on after that, but Rosa found herself thinking about the brave stranger who had risked himself to save her. She didn't know his name, and he didn't know hers, but fate had a funny way of weaving lives together. One afternoon, as she walked toward a bank, she spotted him sitting alone at a small local restaurant near the entrance. She felt her heart flutter as she walked up to his table. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. He looked up, his face registering surprise, and he nodded. "Of course." She sat down, and after a pause, she extended her hand, introducing herself. "I'm Rosa." A smile spread across his face as he shook her hand. "Dan, nice to finally meet you properly." They talked for hours, each story drawing them closer. Rosa learned that Dan owned a small electronics shop, barely scraping by. Their laughter filled the space between them, and something unspoken but powerful passed between their smiles. From that day, Rosa visited Dan's shop regularly. A deep friendship blossomed, and eventually, so did love. But Dan couldn't shake the feeling that he had little to offer her. One evening, as they shared a simple meal in his tiny apartment, she finally confronted him. "Dan, why do you keep pulling away? Don't you like me?" she asked, her voice a mixture of frustration and sadness. Dan sighed, gathering his thoughts before responding. "Rosa, I'm just a small electronics seller. You deserve more than I can give you." Her eyes softened as she took his hand. "I don't care about money, Dan. I've dated men who have everything, but they never treated me with respect. You're different." Her friends began noticing the change in her, and soon her closest friend Lila voiced her concerns. "Rosa, are you sure about Dan? He's, well, Not from our circle. Rosa's face softened with a smile. I'm sure, Lila. I've been with men who had everything but saw me as just another thing to possess. Dan sees me as a person. Her father, Mr. Stan, was equally unconvinced. He valued status and wealth above all and had worked tirelessly to build his empire. When Rosa first mentioned Dan, he reacted with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. A man who sells electronics? He asked, his voice tinged with disdain. Rosa, you come from a family of means. You deserve better. Rosa remained calm but resolute. I love him, Dad. He may not have money, but he has a good heart. Her father muttered, shaking his head. Good hearts don't pay the bills. Despite the tension, Rosa and Dan went ahead with a modest wedding. It was a quiet celebration of love, though the air hung thick with unspoken reservations. Dan felt the weight of his new life, promising himself he'd work as hard as he could to give Rosa a comfortable life. The early years of their marriage were filled with love, but financial struggles loomed. Dan worked hard tirelessly, saving every penny he could. Often, he came home exhausted, finding Rosa waiting for him with a warm meal and a soft smile. You work too hard, Dan, she'd say, gently squeezing his hand. He forced a smile, though inside he felt only shame. I wish I could give you more, Rosa. You deserve so much better. She brushed off his words with a comforting look. I don't need more, Dan. I need you. We're in this together. Time passed, and Dan grew increasingly frustrated as he watched his friends climb the social ladder while he struggled to keep afloat. Then, one fateful day, his old friend Ramal visited his small shop. Dan! Ramal exclaimed with a smirk, looking around the shop. Still here? Dan's face flushed with embarrassment. Yes, just working hard. Ramal laughed, clapping Dan on the shoulder. Come, let me show you what real success looks like. That evening, Ramal took him to his mansion, a sprawling property with high-end cars parked outside. Dan was speechless, his heart pounding with envy. He wanted this life, this luxury. How had Ramal achieved it all? Ramal, how did you do it? Dan finally asked, barely containing his awe. Ramal leaned closer, a knowing smile playing on his lips. It's not for the faint-hearted, Dan. If you're willing to do what it takes, anything is possible. Ramal's face grew serious. There's a way, but it's not for the weak. Are you willing to do whatever it takes? Without fully understanding, Dan nodded. Anything, as long as it means giving Rosa the life she deserves. That night, Ramal introduced Dan to a mysterious figure known as the chairman. His piercing gaze seemed to look straight into Dan's soul as he asked, You want wealth? Dan swallowed, nodding. More than anything. The chairman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You must be willing to give everything, he said, his voice low and ominous. Ramal placed a hand on Dan's shoulder, his tone serious. Think carefully, Dan. Once you step through this door, there's no going back. Dan took a deep breath, steadying himself. I'm ready. When Dan first agreed to do whatever it takes to succeed, he didn't know what it truly meant. He had never questioned Ramal's vague explanations or the cryptic warnings from the chairman. But soon after that meeting, he noticed changes around him, subtle but unsettling. It began with Rosa, his vibrant and loving wife, who started to seem weaker by the day. Her once glowing complexion grew pale, her laughter quieter, her steps slower. Each day she seemed to be fading, as though some invisible force was draining the life from her. At first, Dan dismissed it as mere exhaustion or a mild illness, but as days passed, he could no longer ignore the eerie reality settling over their home. He wanted to take her to the hospital, but she said she will be fine. She was just tired and needed some rest. One night, Dan confronted Ramal. Something's happening to Rosa. She's fading, he said, voice trembling with fear. Ramal's face turned cold. It's the sacrifice. You knew the cost. Dan felt like he'd been punched. What sacrifice? What sacrifice are you talking about? You're saying I have to lose her? Ramal's gaze didn't waver. There's no going back. The spirits don't bargain. There has to be a way to stop this. I can't lose her, Dan begged, his face twisted in agony. Ramal's face was a mask of indifference as he listened. You made your choice, Dan. We all did. You wanted wealth, and this is the cost. Please, anything, Dan whispered, his voice broken. I'll give up everything. But Ramal only shook his head, his gaze cold. It's out of our hands now. The spirits don't bargain, Dan. She was bound the moment you agreed. Dan looked at Ramal with tears in his eyes. He said, Can we go see the chairman? I need to speak with him. Ramal replied, Dan, I already spoke with the chairman on your behalf, and he said you don't have any choice. He also said, she's already dead in spirit. If you don't go through with it, both of you will die. Finally, he said you must remove her heart, blend it, and drink it, or else she will haunt you to death. He was trapped. Dan left, his heart shattered, knowing that he had set in motion an irreversible fate. Every step home felt like walking to his own execution, knowing he would lose the only person who had ever truly loved him. Ramal's words echoed in his mind. Remove her heart, blend it, drink it, or else she will haunt you to death. As he walked into their home that night, the weight of his decisions crushed him completely. He couldn't sleep. Rosa's soft breathing next to him was faint, and each breath seemed weaker than the last. He lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, the weight of Ramal's words pressing on his chest like a boulder. An endless stream of thoughts raced through his mind. Regret, fear, shame. What have I done? He whispered to himself in the dead silence, the enormity of his actions settling in with crushing clarity. Dan thought of telling Rosa everything, the secrets, the sacrifice, the trap he had unknowingly walked into. But each time he turned to look at her fragile form beside him, he could not speak out. He couldn't bear to see the pain in her eyes, the realization of his betrayal. For days, Dan was haunted by his guilt and fear. Every time he looked at Rosa, he saw the consequences of his ambition. Her health deteriorated, her once bright eyes now dull and distant. One night, as she lay in bed, she reached for his hand, whispering, Dan, I love you. Tears filled his eyes as he held her cold hand. I love you too, Rosa, he choked out, his heart breaking. But it was too late. Moments later, her hand fell limp, and she was gone. Desperate, Dan didn't report her death, pretending she was merely ill. He remembers the chairman's instruction, remove her heart, blend it, drink it, or else she will haunt you to death. He was sick to his core, but he couldn't escape his fate. With tear-streaked cheeks, he carried out the ritual as instructed by the chairman, taking the ultimate step to sever the bond, to bind her spirit forever in silence. It was his last hope for peace. The smell was acrid and the taste metallic and revolting, but he forced himself to drink, gagging as he did. Dan sank to the floor, breathing heavily as he finished, hoping, praying that this would finally set him free. He waited, feeling the darkness consume him, hoping the ritual would finally bring him the peace he craved. But that night, as he lay in bed, he felt a chilling presence beside him. He turned, and there she was. Rosa's presence loomed over him, her eyes hollow yet piercing, filled with sorrow and betrayal. Her lips didn't move, but he could hear her voice echo in his mind. Dan, why? He scrambled back, his heart pounding as he clutched his chest. I had to, he stammered, his voice trembling. But she didn't respond. She simply stood there, staring, as if her silence was enough to pierce his soul. One evening, Dan visited Ramal, desperate for an escape. Ramal, she's still here. I did everything just like they said, but she won't leave me. She haunts me every night, he confessed, his voice hollow and broken. Ramal looked at him, his gaze cold and unfeeling. "This is the price you pay, Dan. Some sacrifices don't end just because you complete them," he replied flatly. "I did the same thing with my mum. As a matter of fact, we all did. I don't know why yours is like this. The spirits may have taken her life, but they've bound her soul to yours. There's no way out now." Her spirit kept haunting him, appearing every night, asking silently, "Why?" Desperate for peace, Dan sought out the chairman, begging him to reverse the curse. The chairman only laughed. "You asked for wealth and you received it. Peace, that's something money can't buy." "One night," she said silently, "you must confess to my parents. You must tell them what you did to me." His wealth grew, as promised. Money flowed in, and his business boomed, but he took no pleasure in it. The luxury he once craved felt like a prison now. The more he gained, the emptier he felt. He bought new cars, expanded his shop, but nothing could drown out the sorrow that had embedded itself within him. No material gain could fill the void Rosa's death had left behind. Frustrated and consumed by guilt, Dan couldn't take it anymore. He could barely sleep, eat, or function without feeling Rosa's presence shadowing him. The nights grew longer, each filled with nightmares, as Rosa's face became etched in his mind. Then one morning, after another sleepless and scary night, he drove to Rosa's parents' home, his hands shaking as he knocked on the door. Rosa's mother answered, her eyes filling with confusion at the sight of him. "Mrs. Stan," he began, his voice trembling, There's something I need to tell you." He poured out his confession, the words tumbling over each other as he recounted everything he'd done. As he spoke, he watched her face crumble, the betrayal and sorrow visible in her eyes. Her husband soon joined them, his expression hardening with every word. When Dan finished, there was only silence. Rosa's mother covered her mouth, sobbing softly, while her father stood there, his face a mixture of shock and horror. You monster," he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You killed our daughter. For money?" Dan nodded, the weight of his guilt crushing him. "I thought it would make everything better," he muttered, tears streaming down his face. "I never imagined it would end like this." Rosa's father didn't respond. Instead, he walked inside, calling the police. Dan didn't resist as they arrived and led him away in handcuffs. He felt relief mingled with the overwhelming sorrow, knowing that finally he was paying the price he deserved. In the cell, haunted by the memories, he finally understood the true price of wealth. He had chased a dream and in return lost everything he held dear. Ramal and his cult vanished, leaving Dan to face his demons alone. Moral of the story: be careful what you wish for. The price of greed is often far greater than you can imagine. The end. Thanks for watching. Did you enjoy the video? Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. See you next time.